Never before in history had a minority been so willing to put it all on the line in resisting their own tribal identity with who God is and what does it mean to follow him and be in right relationship with one's neighbor, to the point where the followers of Jesus were willing to put down their lives, their treasure, their social standing, their social status, everything, including their family's support, to affirm that Christ had resurrected. But they're also willing to report how much they were deluded and how much they went along with the scapegoating at first. So what happened between the events of the Passion and then the events of Acts? I'm David Gornoski, and we're back for another Things Hidden podcast discussion. Today, I have Surit Dasgupta join me. How you doing, Surit?
I'm doing fine, brother. How are you?
Good. I want to talk today about a topic that I think is foundational to understanding why we keep diving into the topic of victim concern and what we call Christ hauntedness on this program. It's a little bit obtuse for the outside listener who's not familiar with some of the nomenclature that we've developed. But I thought that today's topic could be how sacrifice retards progress in the modern world. And generally speaking, this is the reason why I have pushed people away from politics as a form of creating solutions. Politics being something that is an institution founded on the continuance, or what we could say the vestige of ritual sacrifice. And even in its modern form, politics has a lot of Christological influence that tries to improve upon older forms of sacrificial institutions in history. For example, today we have in the West 12 jurors that decide the fate of the accused, who is the 13th one. The 13th one being the role of Christ in the biblical text. This is not accidental. This is intentional. This is an example of our society trying to model the gospel in terms of its structure for law and order and justice. So you have 12 seeming jurors that are supposed to be peers. That doesn't turn out to be the case, just like 12 disciples, and then the 13th being Jesus in the role of the person being accused. Now you would say to yourself, how in the world could society pattern its most famous deity in the role of the person being accused of a crime? I mean, how many wicked, horrible people have been accused of crimes? Murderers, rapists, child molesters. And you're telling me that the West patterned the role of the person standing on trial in the role of the Christ? Absolutely. That's because the God of the biblical text is found on the side of the person who's being accused by the entire city. In this case, Jesus, accused by his community to the point where Pilate is united with Herod. Enemies are united as friends in their common rejection and expulsion and torture and killing and condemnation of the innocent person in Jesus. That is such a dramatic change of what is considered to be divine, that we have inherited it such that we give the position of the Christological figure to the person being accused in a court system, meaning we give them so much presumption of innocence that we would put them in that role, that they would have then the right to a trial where they can actually have someone judge the facts of the case rather than being convicted without a trial. This is an invention of a Christian-inspired, Christian-infected society like the West. It's not perfect, though. Of course, we know that judges are corrupt. We know that attorneys are corrupt. They collude with prosecutors. They collude even with small towns and big cities. We know that juries are not exactly given the facts that there's a lot of ways of manipulation. We understand that there's a lot of rigging with the plea bargain deal where everybody is given massive, insane sentences if they go to trial, so they take a plea. We know there's a lot of corruption to it, but still the structure has an inspiration from Christ in terms of its protection of those who are accused. The state prosecutor being the role of the accuser, and the defense attorney being the role of the Holy Spirit, the paraclete, the one who defends. Of course, that's the structure of it. The reality of humans as they are sinful, wicked, fallen, confused, selfish, whatever, corrupts all of that. But what I'm trying to suggest is that the role of sacrifice is what gets in the way of progress happening. Right now in the West, everybody is in a state of chaos, and the world over is, because they emulate the West, and their mimetic role model in the West is acting insane. And so therefore the whole world is imitating that insane pattern because it doesn't know how to get past victimism. It doesn't know how to get past its attempt to create sacrificial order through victimism, through the alliance of people who are perceived to be victims or allies of victims, uniting against somebody else. The narratives are scrambled. There is no order. One of the things that Christianity does is it allows people to see that you cannot create true progress through sacrifice. Is that you can't really actually make new wealth through sacrifice. This is similar to the concept about government, that government can't create wealth. It can only redistribute wealth from one group to another. In a similar way, sacrificial violence, putting people in prison, going to war, taxing some group, waging war against one ethnicity through demographic replacement concepts, all these different ways of sacrificing people and pitting people against each other. None of those things actually produce an expansion of wealth. It merely is redistributing the level of aggression and coercion from one person or one group to another. And I think that's important for understanding why politics cannot produce wealth and why any thought that is related to sacrificial coercion cannot generate progress or anything that benefits people in a zero in a win-win situation.
Yeah, that what you have said is absolutely correct. And on top of that, I would also like to add that Christianity not only proves that progress and sacrifice cannot go together, uh, it also reveals a lot about power that Christians to this day refuse to realize, and that power is basically a cowardly way out most of the time, especially when we speak about stately power, right? So when we are hiring, politicians or enforcers of the state to get our neighbors in line, in other words, to get them, in with the program, right? To get them in line, we are also putting a stumbling block in front of our neighbors, much more talented neighbors, out of envy, so that they are unable to, creatively spark a revolution, not revolution in the violent sense, but a revolution in the Jesus sense. We are putting a hurdle in front of our neighbors who are much more talented, and and by doing that, we are stopping God from working with creation organically. So when we when we implement these coercive, when we help the state implement these coercive measures to do things like fight the drug war, and you know implement a mandatory drug for on a mass scale, we are really stagnating our progress in history, and we are not really letting creative people take the helm as it should be.
Yeah, right now you have a lot of people who are, if you go on social media, you see a rise in people being angry at other people based on racial lines, on gender lines, constant, cynical, jaded degradation of of joy, of wonder, of hope, possibilities, delights. All those things are being totally cynically spit upon by our society because they are all sacrificially enclosed, meaning they don't believe anything is going to happen better in history. And that's how you know they're enmeshed in a sacrificial logic of society, because they don't think history goes anywhere, especially anywhere good. Faith is about trusting that one does not have to search in vain for all against one dramas to find your transcendence, nor does one need to delude oneself into believing that they are not copying their neighbor's desires when in fact they are. That's what faith is about. It's about trust. Trusting that future of the world is a good and better place to be than what it is now. Trusting that one does not have to search in vain for all against one dramas. Right now, right wing is finally discovering all kinds of new ideas. They think that they will solve their problems. The left is trying to, get rid of their monsters, their scapegoats. They're trying to, always fight over who is the big villain to destroy. Is it Russia? Is it North Korea? Is it China? Is it what's going on with the battle between the Palestinians and the Israelis? Which one is the good guy? Which one is the villain to unite around against? All of these things are sacrificially enclosed dramas, meaning they are dependent on the coercion and killing of somebody to supposedly solve a solution. It's not going to work. It's only going to keep us in more and more schisms, because we can't agree on who is the villain. We can't agree on we don't believe anybody is truly, truly, truly guilty of anything anymore. There's always that sneaking suspicion that we might have overplayed our guilt attribution to our opponents, which makes the effect very displeasurable and very, very uncomfortable, which makes people mad. They go insane. And that's what's happening right now. They can't get people on board 100% with any of these causes. They can't get them 100% pro-Ukraine. They can't get them 100% pro-Russia. And that includes people in the West and people in Russia. It includes people in Ukraine and people in America. Nobody can get 100% convinced of the diabolical scapegoat evil of their opponent they're told to hate. And the same thing goes for all of the domestic disputes. Right now, you have a deep, deep, deep fatigue setting in the West. People don't want to work. They don't want to try hard. They don't want to do anything great. They don't want to spend extra effort achieving something great, because, again, they believe that there's nothing else to do, that history has been basically settled, and the only thing we can do is to try to, basically chop up the power distribution in a more equitable way, or to try to return to some previous period of history. If you're a conservative person, that somehow that will be the solution to everything. None of those fantasies will work, because victimism is really a dead end in terms of growth. Victimism is the attempt to use the concern for victims to gain power and advantage over other people. This victim power is the felt experience of living under the shadow of the cross and coveting its power for one's own self-gain over others. That is the number one thing driving everything in the West. And because the world imitates the West still, the whole world is being infected with this victimist power, this victim power, this ability, this attempt to feel the shadow of the cross looming over your head, to feel that something happened in history, and to try to situate oneself socially in relationship to one's neighbor in a way in which you can justify yourself as being on the side of the person being crucified in a situation. And this includes a whole host of different forms. The right has its own victims. The right has its own victim tropes that it trots out to gain power and energy. The left has its own victims to trot out. Nobody wants to understand why they have such a desire to trot out victims. There's no other explanation but what I am talking about with Christian anthropology that explains this deep, deep need to align oneself in relationship to your neighbor with a cadre of victims, to either consider to call yourself a victim or to align yourself with as many socially powerful victims as possible. And the biggest, most powerful form of victimism is victimism that can be visually seen in the real world. It's one of the reasons why the Trump attacks have been backfiring on the people doing the Trump indictments, is because they thought if we call him a convicted felon, that's like a Gnostic label that will define him as dirty and lowbrow. But then when people see the visual of someone going to court while they're trying to run for office, and they see that in contrast to all the other politicians that have ever held office, and they say, are you really telling me that these little stupid obscure charges are the first time that the blind Lady Justice of America could ever find a crime on a politician? Nobody can believe this myth. It can't be believed, right? And so there's something visceral about it that makes even people who hate Trump recoil, such that it is becoming way more fashionable now for Hollywood celebrities and other little goobers who are always a good bellwether of where mimetic winds are moving in society, are now saying it's cool to like Trump. After all the aspersions of his character, after everything they've done for so long, the scapegoat narrative has finally clicked in, and it's becoming increasingly cool to like Trump, because the visceral reality of seeing the first politician, in fact, the first president, trotted out as a criminal, and the charges are so insanely ridiculous. And you think to yourself, Bill Clinton never did anything on level with, these filing issues that he's been 34 felonies for with the New York trial. Hillary Clinton never did anything like that, never in her entire life. Mitt Romney never did a single thing, anything close to that. McCain, none of them, just blind Lady Justice, never sniffed out anything criminal on any of those people except for this one guy. And people viscerally recoil at it because this is a Christ-haunted society, which means anything that smells and feels viscerally like the image of God being abandoned by humanity, left to die a torturous death, will have the power in history. Whether you like it or not, that's the reality. And you can fake it, but in reality, the making it of it is what really counts, because people have been trotting out their victim. Hillary's a victim because she's a female and all this stuff, right? Or these more Gnostic type victim labels. Well, because I'm a female, I'm a victim, but you're not indicted. You're not criminally in trial. Nothing's happening. No one's taking your home, Hillary. You're fine. You're just using a kind of, I guess, a veneer of victimism that just doesn't have the level of visceral reality, like watching a former president being trotted into his probation officer and being sentenced on July coming up here.
Yeah, I mean, I saw that video of 50 Cent being interviewed just after he visited the Capitol, and asking the reporter was asking him about what he thought of these front indictments, and he replied that he was identifying more with Trump now. And she asked why, and he said because he has a RICO case against him. So that sort of like proves your point, basically. And one thing about victimism is like many people like it has the allure of of an underdog versus the powerful antagonist or whatever. But the tragic thing about victimism is that victimism makes the victim the oppressor. It doesn't provide any equity. It doesn't provide any equality, and it provides nothing at all. And everybody knows that once the victim becomes the oppressor, then people won't really see whether the oppressor was once a victim or not. People will just see the oppressor for what the oppressor is. And then we're back to square one again with the oppressor victim dynamic. And the brilliance of Christianity, as you rightly pointed out, is that it no longer gives us this ability to, unite with the oppressor. We are physically and mentally unable to do so, even if we wanted to, because as we see with the Gaza thing, like many right wing people were at one time were pro Israel, but because they're seeing all of these images popping up on the internet, that isn't helping Israel's PR at all. Like that's just how Western societies are. That the underdog is automatically seen as the hunted one. Like the one that is worthy of support, basically. So yeah, the underdog, thanks to Jesus Christ, the underdog has now all of the momentum in history, and it is really the underdog that gets the that gets everything going.
Yeah, and again, that doesn't mean that that is objectively ascertainable. Like some people are going to make fraudulent forms of underdog narratives, and it doesn't mean that. Again, I get very stupid, dumb binary thinking always makes it so that when I'm saying this, they say, well, that means you're saying Trump is the Christ figure. And it's like, no, this is the way society will unfold, period. Whether you're a grievous sinner or not, you can get found caught up in a scapegoat narrative that backfires on the people scapegoating you. Okay, even if you, but I mean, it's like it's a one way to look at it. One way you could say is proportionality of justice. For example, right? Somebody could kill somebody, right? Murder somebody, and then society says, some local city says, we're going to fillet them alive, draw and quarter them, hang them, chop their fingers off, and we're going to do it all live on our public access TV and stream it on Twitter. Okay, you see what I mean? That's the same kind of thing where it's like, okay, someone may be factually guilty of an evil thing like murder, but society will still recoil at the proportionality of the punishment used, right? And that's part of that Christ hauntedness feature of our society, right? Is that people viscerally recoil when they feel like, okay, this person is being unfairly, blackballed or whatever what you want to call it, being witch hunted, being unfairly obliterated, so to speak, in different ways, in a disproportionate way. And that's kind of that blind scales of Lady Justice concept that Christ haunted West was trying to calibrate correctly. And people are viscerally scared when they feel like blind scales of Lady Justice are totally rigged completely to the point where even a president isn't safe. That makes the whole society feel unsafe, right? Because like it or not, presidents are like little high priest avatar icons of a community. And when they are at the whims of crooked justice, that means that the spirit of the Maddened mob is breaking through and breaching through the restraining forces of things like a fair justice system. A lady, you'll watch a video of a guy being sentenced because he was convicted of murdering someone's kids, and the lady screams at them, and the court says, "Be quiet, ma'am. Do not speak." Right? Because these are institutions that the West has created to try to tamp down on mimetic vengeance spilling out of control, right? If people are allowed to just throw ninja star knives at anybody they want, then you're devolving the justice system into a level of primal violent chaos that will rip apart a society once society believes that the justice system is completely irredeemably corrupt, right? And of course it's corrupt, but it's the level of visceral corruption that is what symbolically gets destroyed when you see a president being thrown into the level of charges and nonsense. You say, my God, they're all guilty of crimes beyond what he ever did. And the fact that he's trumped up on this means that the system itself is breaching, it's being breached by the spirit of the Maddened mob, which is the spirit of vengeance, which devours the human species, which is why the human species viscerally recoils at this kind of scapegoating thing going so far, because it's almost like the human species viscerally understands, like when you're facing a tiger face on and there's nothing to stop you from being devoured by a tiger, it viscerally feels the wrath of its own species breathing down its neck when it realizes that the restraining institutions that have developed to hold the crowd mob back have been totally undermined, right? I mean, you know this as someone, you know, we can speak a little bit, right? The other countries have Maddened mobs a little bit more closer to home than what people in the West have grown accustomed to. And this is because of the West's relative extra time being infected by Christianity as a dominant force of society, right?
Yes, you're right. We can see these examples in many places around the world. You have religious riots, you have race riots, all of these things. And it is my opinion that people in the West, especially people in America, don't haven't really experienced what a real riot looks like. And when they go to some of these countries that are outside of the influence of the West, or even like just barely influenced by the West, they will see that what brutal mob violence looks like. Like we had tribal violences in Northeast India, where rape and murder were just far too common. And when people were beginning to see these footages, they were just outraged, and it really impacted the elections that were held in India this year. So this mob violence, like this, it really gives us a taste. Once we see these kinds of violence, it gives us a taste of what you know uh, what civilization prior to the coming of Christ really looked like. And that mob violence, like you were talking about the concept of habeas corpus, right? Innocence until presumed guilty. In the old days, they didn't really have that. In the old days, divinity was not compared, was not identical to the underdog or the victim, but it was pure might makes right. Like whoever was on the winning side, whoever has had the most manpower, and each of these things, that was a sign of divinity in those days. And something I think the average person in the West will find this ludicrous, but that was really the reality of what it looked like back in history, and even it even exists these days, certain parts of the world.
Yeah. Yeah. There's an attempt to, some people on the right want to impose a Catholic theocracy. Some of them want to have a race war against, and they're just being duped into the dumbest narratives that will protect oligarchic interests. The only way to defeat oligarchs, in my opinion, is to double down on the way of the cross, which means to imitate Christ, to tell the truth, to create a society around you that is built on mimetic truth telling, mimetic competition of nonviolence. Who can be the most nonviolent? Who can be the most forgiving, right? You can compete on that. Even it may seem like a scandalous way to perfect one's behavior, but one can compete on non-vengeance. One can compete with your neighbor on who is most forgiving. One can compete with your neighbor on who is more graceful. One can compete with one neighbor on who is more contractually honest. One can create a mimetic cycle of one-upmanship that is friendly competitively and also positive for cohesion in society. One of the problems I think that societies that don't have a lot of Christ infection in them and therefore don't have a lot of that spirit of rejecting mob violence and crowd anger against outsiders is that one is not able to really do cutting edge technologies in a society that can barely keep the mob at bay. You see what I mean? When the mob is
Yeah.
barely at bay All of society's resources and high IQ people and high trust institutions are all developed around just keeping that Maddened mob spirit contained. It's all of the energy is focused on that. This is why we talk about countries in Central America, countries like El Salvador, other places that have been racked with sacrificial violence, mob lynchings based on gangs and all this stuff. And there's a lot of wickedness going on at the top of these governments, which are also vestiges of mobs and sacrificial violence in a ritualistic sense. But all of these things are these societies. We're not thinking that El Salvador will come up with the next groundbreaking Nikola Tesla invention, because that president is barely trying to keep the violence contained, much less be able to create the foundation for higher order levels of society to develop that will allow for the luxury, so to speak, of grand inventions and art and discovery. Now, having said that, it's a paradox because oftentimes in times of disarray and cultural upendings, there can be great innovations that take place and great art can be made. So it's not, I don't want to make this one-to-one correlation that, you must have really, great luxurious wealth and capital built up to be able to allow for great art and innovation. I think those things in science, engineering, and art can happen even in hard, vicious, difficult times. But there's something about a societal inheritance founded on Christ, which is always telling the truth. Jesus tells the truth. So that means you have to tell your truth. You have to tell the truth as it relates to your neighbor. You can't lie about your neighbor because they're a different ethnicity. Okay. That has to maintain, this kind of, I got to protect my tribe over and above the truth is bullshit in a Christ haunted society. It's got to go. It's going to go to the trash dump of history, and we're going to send it there faster the more our society wakes up to the secret sauce that is Christianity that makes our society flourish.
Well, what you said reminded me of this debate that I was recently watching between an Orthodox Christian and Dave Smith, and they were arguing about libertarianism. But at one point in that debate, something came up about duties. Like, we have these duties, and we have all of these rights, but we don't have any duties. So the Orthodox Christian who was debating, he was talking about he was talking about duties, and Dave Smith asked him, "What duty? Like, give me an example of a duty." Uh, so that this person brought up conscription. So Dave Smith, of course, being familiar with all of these wars that that the U.S. has been pulled into, and saying, like, and gave him an example of, like, if suppose if you are called up to fight in Ukraine, would you do it? Is that a duty for you? And this person, even though being Orthodox Christian, said yes. And I was shocked because this for this person, being a statist worshiper was far higher on his priority list than the words of Jesus, which is, "You shall not kill your brother." And this is really what tribalism that you were referring to, ethnicity, tribalism, this obligation towards this duty thing, state duty or whatever. It's, if that holds priority above you, above Christ, above non-violence, above teachings of Christ, turning the other cheek, if that holds priority for you, then you're really trapped, and you won't be able to get out of it. And when you're burdened with all of these duties, violence weighs heavily upon you, because you don't have any time to come up with all of these innovations. You don't have any time come up with
Yeah.
life affirming inventions.
Because not only is scapegoat mobs at your door societally, but also envy. There's a lot of cultures, traditional societies that talk about the evil eye. And the evil eye is a sign that one does not have enough transcendence uniting people in a kind of nonviolent, positive mimetic direction, like imitating Christ and his spirit, right? When you have that, but it's kind of truncated into another idol where you objectify Christ because you got a little image of him or something, or whatever it is, you try to truncate him as a ticket into a special boy status, rather than actually thinking about, wait, how can I become like Christ in this moment when this person is disrespectful to me or making me feel jealous or whatever it is. That truncation of Christ into an object that one obtains for a special boy status in relationship to others ends up retarding the ability of imitation of Christ to take over in your society, to the point where you have people worried about an evil eye staring at you because, don't tell people you had success. Don't tell people you had the winning lottery, or else you might get burglarized in your house. You know, someone once told me, oh, we can't have there were in America, they have self-serving fountain drinks where you can go up in the gas stations and fill up your drink, these giant soda things, right? And then there's also a phenomenon of buffets that people who don't have they want to go to eat, they can get whatever plates they want. They can have 10 plates, they can have 2 plates of food. I was talking to a person from another country, and they said, we can't have those things in our country because people would literally camp out and steal. They would just sit there and get there at lunch and stay there till dinner and use things to put little Tupperware to put their little or little plastic containers.
Yeah,
to
they would take
home.
everything for at least a week. They would take they would empty everything, into their bags.
And so you see, well, that's the extent to which societies do not have Christological form that they are conforming to, because these things that we take for granted, in which we say, well, we are to be orderly. Take 1 cup, sir. Take one, don't be here 24 hours eating from every plate and stuffing food in your purses. This kind of high trust society. I often use this image of one time I was in a city, and it was a dense urban setting, and they had a farmer who had raw milk that he was selling from his cows. And it looked like he had hired somebody who was a bit of a tweaker or something to be the managing the farm stand of the raw milk, because I found her laying down in a barn or something asleep while they were supposed to be managing everything. But regardless, there was a self-serve section where you could get your gallon of raw milk, and then you insert the amount of money based on how much you've taken. If you take 3 gallons, then you insert that much cash through the little slit, the little glass slit or whatever, right? The same thing, they had another one for bee honey, for people who want honey, self-serve. Put your little money in there and get your little honey. And nothing was stolen. I'm sure it has been stolen from time to time, but largely speaking, it's obviously worked enough that he could maintain that as his business model. And that's not a given. Societies are not born; they don't pop out of in a vacuum of human. The human species does not pop out of its egg like that. That is a lot of hard-fought cultural inheritance of the truth of Christ, that you are to treat your neighbor with love, that you are to help even the Samaritan who is of a different tribe than you, even to the point of risking your own life because you might be set up for ambush from a group of bandits using him as bait, to the point where, rain falls on the just and the freaks and the losers. That's what God says. This is stuff that has been baked into our imaginations and our cultural mores, are moral standards that are unconsciously determined and passed down. And we tinker with these things to our own destruction. We tinker with these things to our own great demise. And it's scary what can happen if we continue to flippantly disregard these things, whether it's a left-wing move which wants to radically outcompete Christ with some new coalition of victim grievances with violence, or it's this right-wing move to try to go to some kind of stupid theocracy by force that's just a cheap ripoff of Islam, or maybe it's a some stupid some stupid whining and wandering and desire for Nietzschean paradise to return. All of these things have the ability to start creating a bad blood experience in which there is no positive external transcendence that one can participate in, an imitation of the Holy Spirit, an imitation of following God. That one only uses God insofar as an ideological cudgel to beat down one's neighbor. If you do use the concept of God, it's as a weapon. I mean, there are people, these new Gen Z conservatives, that want to outlaw different people from being able to hold office by force. All this type of stuff is a cudgel attempt, using the cross as a cudgel, as a sharp piece on the end of the stick, and you hitting someone with it. This is a bastardization of everything it means to imitate Christ, and yet it's becoming the new normal by a lot of young people because they're all, what I'm trying to get at is, they're all coming up with stupid, bad ideas that go nowhere because they can't imagine the world outside of a mythic enclosure of sacrificial violence.
Well, yeah, I mean, they have been brought up being enslaved to big power, coercive power, and all they really know is the language of coercive power. So what really needs to be highlighted here is that, like what you were describing, the high trust, these examples of high trust society where, if somebody sells lemonade on the stand like that, that won't be stolen. It usually isn't stolen, but we see all of these Democrat-run cities. I've been seeing videos of it, countless videos of it, where shoplifting has become common over there. So that's the result of, too much welfare, too much, government overreach. Like, basically the government has been acting as nanny to these people who are used to having welfare and all of that. And therefore their minds are hardwired and reprogrammed towards, just taking handouts, right, without any punishment at all, and not even taking, when they're not getting any handouts, they help themselves to whatever they want, and they empty stores en masse. And so these Gen Z conservatives and all of these new right thinkers that you're talking about don't see that's the problem. They don't see that there is a problem with America, especially in the bigger cities, losing its frontier spirit of having, a do-it-yourself approach towards life, where you're having this buffet and all of that. You're working to get your meal. You're working to get your car fixed or whatever. Is losing this frontier spirit, and
But you
you
can't have
can't
it
really.
because you have it all regulated away. If you want to build
That's
a
the thing.
home, you have to have
Hmm.
zoning codes and regulatory codes that are all rigged by the builders associations and the guilds and the unions and the air conditioned people. They're all union. They're all gaming the system to make it impossible to innovate in the terms of building a home. You can't innovate in terms of building a car to make it very cheap and affordable that you don't need oligarchic banks to finance it. All of these things are captured by corrupted forces that are all only able to persist in their corruption because of the monopoly of violence that is the state. And nobody wants to strike that at its core except a few crazy folks, but they don't do it the right way. And so that's why they don't do anything that helps it. Uh, because you can't fight the state by being angry that you don't have the power. That just makes you become like a statist, even though you
Well, I
don't
mean,
call people a statist.
I
I
mean,
don't like
I've
that
heard
word
of this.
statist either because it ends up marginalizing. It's not the right framing, but it can have its
But I think
utility.
it's I think there's a lot of helpful things that to be gained from the libertarian worldview, especially on things like coerciveness, like the non-aggression principle. People like to hit back at the at the non-aggression principle, thinking like that if anybody is doing some degenerate stuff out there, that you won't be able to do anything about it. So that's why it's automatically a faulty worldview or whatever. But at the same time, you have these people who are like, if your neighbor is listening to some music out loud, you call the police. Like, that's an escalation. that's literally a slave minded person who calls the police whenever, this example, like I read the story about this woman painting her house, in the style of Van Gogh's Starry Night, right? And the cops showed up, right? And because that was not within the regulations or the town regulations or whatever, right? I Correct me if I'm wrong. So that's like the example of how statism and how state worship, like literally a substitute for God. State worship is taking hold of people's minds, and when these kinds of things happen, you not only put a dent in uh, in the sphere of innovation, but you also put a dent in the sphere of beauty. People can't beautify their homes anymore. People can't make their homes people can't make beautiful art anymore. And what you instead are, left with is, all of these propaganda and violence, and all of these uh, art filled with violence, and so on and so forth. So if you want to see something that is not violent, that is not coercive, then you should be able to have the freedom to make your own beautiful non-violent art, which encourages people to reconcile. But unfortunately, we don't have that these days.
Yeah, I before I forget, I put this down here. The cross awakens the awareness of victims under our cultural practices and events. However, we are more likely to scapegoat or sacrifice differentiation before we are likely to renounce our all against one protective mechanism for order and togetherness. Now, the reason we are likely to attack differentiation instead of renouncing our violence is that differentiation is the arbitrary reason for why someone is selected as a scapegoat. But that does not mean that differentiation in and of itself is evil, but rather it is a much more convenient thing to war against as a human than violence in the universal sense, because one wants to always maintain a distance between themselves and being considered guilty of the same thing that they find so repugnant in other people, right? One does not want to look at the mirror. And if one does not want to look in the mirror, it's easier to separate oneself from boundaries of differentiation. For example, one can say, hey, well, all the violence and crime going on and all those shoplifting is a product of capitalism. It's those neoliberal capitalists. Well, maybe you're rich and a beneficiary of capitalism, but if you denounce it, it's a kind of way to attack the differentiation, capitalist versus non-capitalist or whatever, versus saying, wait, this is a sign of a universal problem of violence and human envy and covetousness that's going on here, both at the shoplifter level and the corporate billionaire level. Okay. One can't do that. One has to more likely situate the problem as a problem of differentiation. Someone has more money than somebody else. That's too much differentiation. Another one is ethnicity. Oh, it's this group is causing all these problems, or that group causes all these problems, or this group causes those problems because they were aggrieved here, here, and here, and this group was that, as opposed to all human groups have the tendency to hurt and exploit and otherize other human groups when they have the opportunity to do so, which means that it's another human universal tendency towards scapegoating violence. And it's not something intrinsic to someone's DNA, right, or their skin tone that makes them likely to participate in collective violence, but rather the opportunity that's passed down culturally. Some people culturally, generationally grow up in a Christ, I guess, rejecting culture, right? I mean, you can grow up in a culture that normalizes a lot of horrible violence to animals, for example. Some people grow up, their grandparents tortured dogs, their parents tortured dogs, and they torture dogs. Okay, that's a Christ-hating framework to have that gets passed down culturally. It's not a DNA thing; it's a cultural thing, right? But then, and so it becomes this impossibility to talk about these things because, again, we've been loaded with so much victimism guilt that you can't even have a frank conversation about these different layers of issues without running into people emotionally not being able to control themselves and trying to get, again, victim points off of you. Everybody wants to gain up everybody wants to go raise up the social ladder of status based on victim points. One way you can do it is to show that you're a victim. Another way to do it is to show you're an ally of victims. And another way to do it is to try to take a scalp of somebody else who says something which is not on the latest language of how you are to deify the latest victims and how you're supposed to talk about things. And of course, there's the mere opposite of that on the right? The more nasty you get, right? The more racist you get, the more anti this ethnic group or that ethnic group you get is a sign of your purity, that you're ascending the purity spiral. You're going up and up and up. The other one is going up and up and up, but the more vicious they are in attacking, revenge. They're getting their revenge on oppressors. So all of this is a mere doubling of one another.
What ends up happening is anyone who is engaging in this mimetic back and forth, they end up worshiping their rivals instead of Christ.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. And what does it mean to worship Christ? That's another thing.
To imitate him, I guess. And when you are worshiping your neighbor, you end up imitating your neighbor likewise, right? Like if you're worshiping your opponent, let's say that if the right is worshiping, if the right is in a back and forth with the statist leftists, then they end up being statist right wingers.
Yeah. For example, God created the elements. You are creating God's image, which means you need to understand how elements work. Which means if you are caught up in textbook thinking in a dogmatic way, and therefore you never even bother to look at rethinking what your textbook says about elements, then you'll get caught up focusing on who's to blame for the divorce rate in America. Is it women or men? Who's to blame for the crime in America? Is it this group or that group? Who's to blame for the destruction of literacy? Is it this group, and why is it this group, and who is doing it to this group or that group? Who tricked this group? Who tricked that group? Who stole this person's thing, this, that? All this is blame games. This is called the sacrificial enclosure. You're looking to find out who to blame. You're not looking to solve anything.
We're imitating Satan when we're doing that, because Satan is the accuser.
Yeah. That's right.
His name literally means the accuser.
Right. That's why Peter was called the accuser by Jesus, because he didn't want to, at that time, he didn't want to face up to the reality of his own community's sins that got it to the point where it was. He wanted to say, no, we are righteous in relationship to our oppressors, and therefore don't tell me you're going to lay down your life. Why would you lay down your life? What a missed opportunity. We are more pure than they are. We are less guilty than they are, which means we have victim power, right? So Peter was being a victimist there when he said, don't say you're going to die on the cross. That's an impure, horrible thought. Like, the king is someone who rules over the people who are the better people than the other people. And you're better, in this case, Peter's mind, because they were chosen by God and they were unjustly persecuted by dogs. And why would dogs kill the king of the good people, right? So, and in Jesus's mind, what are you talking about? You're the hero we've been looking for. Why would you be killed by dogs? How does that show that you're with God? So he totally didn't get it. He had a little bit of mixture of might makes right and victimism there. You get a little proto-victimism is cooking there in his mind. You can see it in the text. It's not as pronounced as we know it today, but
maybe because he was around with Christ.
Yeah. But Christ does not produce victimism. Let's be clear.
Right.
Sin produces victimism in reaction to Christ's innocence. That's important.
Yeah, that's why Christ told the ancient Judeans at that time to carry the load of their, like, the occupiers, right? Like when they're forced to carry it 1 mile, then carry it 2 miles, right? The Christ did not, and this is very important for the dissident right of these days, is that Christ did not authorize any rebellion And in fact, he's warning against the Jews at that time, warning them that Jerusalem will be destroyed, was in context of them having a rebellious spirit, that they were already planning to rebel against Rome. And he was telling them, don't do this, because if you do this, Rome will crush you. And that is exactly what happened in AD 70. Jerusalem was crushed by the Romans because the Jews at that time did not accept Christ as their Messiah. Instead, was crying out for Barabbas, who was who was a rebel.
It's something interesting happens in the way the Gospels portray the disciples of Christ, that they sold him out. They became part of the spirit of the crowd. They couldn't resist the irresistible contagion of groupthink and group feeling that was pulling them in to betray him when he was being persecuted. This is a symbol of what we all do in life. We all look, unfortunately, to find meaning and togetherness by joining a crowd. I could think independently. I could act morally right, but that's too hard. It's better to take a little bit of a shortcut sometimes and distance myself and to blame other people for our problems. We don't like blame being on top of our necks. But ultimately, they were afraid of their own life being extinguished that allowed them to be fearful of that blame. They were afraid of being associated with someone who was considered to be of ill reputation by the mob that was killing him and torturing him and blaming him for their community's problems. And the Gospels record that because it's meant to reveal the reality of all culture before and since, and help us to come out of that problem in a cleaner, healthier, safer way, in a more holistic and salvific way for the world. And I think it's interesting that we skip over how profound it is that something truly did have to happen between his death and his burial, and then what they report is the resurrection. Because never before in history had a minority been so willing to put it all on the line in resisting their own tribal identity with who God is and what does it mean to follow him and be in right relationship with one's neighbor, to the point where the followers of Jesus were willing to put down their lives, their treasure, their social standing, their social status, everything, including their family's support, to affirm that Christ had resurrected. But they're also willing to report how much they were deluded and how much they went along with the scapegoating at first. So what happened between the events of the Passion and then the events of Acts, where the book of Acts, in which these same disciples who admit that they all sold him out to various degrees, they all backed away from their hero, they all bent to the power of the mob and the power of the false sense of religion. But every single one of them, something happens between the events that they report of their own failings and then the way in which they acted afterwards, in which they saw something and experienced something that truly gave them more power and more urgency than ever before to see things clearly, to the point where they were willing to tell the truth about their own failures in the texts written about their interactions with Jesus. Something had given them way more courage than the courage they demonstrated during his Passion. Something happened. Something real happened that really transformed their outlook and their ability to perceive what was going on. At some point, and even Peter, who represents all human beings, is selling out his own follower, his own hero, his own master. You know, he's not at a point where he's saying, if you interviewed him, then are you serving the living God? He'd say, no way. If you interviewed him when he was around the fire being quizzed about his accent, in relationship to the person they were putting on trial. If you had a reporter come by and say, "Hey, Mr. Caiaphas, I want to ask you a question," or "Peter, I want to ask you a question. Do you believe that this guy is God?" He'd say, "No way. I just said I don't even know him." "Do you believe he's resurrecting in a couple days?" "No way. I just said I don't even know who this dude is." He didn't believe it at that point. He was locked in the mindset of all human beings who want to create sacrificial violence to get along. He was willing to go along to get along. He was willing to be a part of the bystander effect. He was willing to not do anything to rock the boat. I mean, this is a guy who was literally walking on water with the dude. And now he's selling him out because he doesn't have the courage to walk on water of social storms. Okay. So it's important for us to think about what happened there could have been and truly should be seen as something that was a true event. That God came back from death, and that it was so astoundingly powerful that they reversed course from their pattern of cowardice and submission to the mob to their active resistance to the spirit of the mob, not with violence, but with nonviolence. So we know by the testimony of the gospel apostles themselves that they saw a nonviolent, non-retributive God, because they don't come back when they finally, "Oh, he's resurrected, and now I'm going to kill anybody who doesn't submit to him." That's how we know they were following a false, dead, dumb God. It's the fact that they're serving the real God that they emulate complete nonviolence and non-resistance in terms of their approach to telling the truth about what they saw to the point of torturous death.
Like you spoke about that, like Christ did not come back. Like when he resurrected, he did not come back as an avenging God, right? But what we do, what Christians do these days, is we delay that. Also, he's gonna come back like that in when the book of Revelation is unraveled, right? He's going to come in on the white horse, and he's going to, although there's nothing in the text there that really says that Christ is going to kill human beings, but we read that into the text when we see all of the symbolism that is very apocalyptic, right? Where he's covered in blood, but they assume like, okay, he's going to be covered in blood like Rambo or John Wick, right? Like he's going to murder his enemies, and he's going to have his blood, have their blood all over himself. That's how people read into the text, and that's really something that keeps back a lot of Christians, is that they end up worshiping the violence that doesn't exist in Christ's revelation. They end up worshiping that, and by doing that, they end up creating a fake objectified God, that is easily molded into whatever they wish to, like a flag, like they're waving Christ as a flag. This is our war banner. But that's not how Christ is. Christ is actually an interactive, living, breathing, divine being, right? He's not someone who is an inanimate object. You can't handle him like that. Even if you do handle him like an inanimate object, you will still end up exposing yourself and your true agenda in the process, right? You will end up giving yourself away. So yeah, that is what happened, I guess, with Peter as well, because when he was trying to discourage Christ from going to the cross, he was thinking that Christ was going to be the messianic banner by which they will conquer their enemies, and a lot of people were thinking like that at that time. But Christ and demonstrated the very way, and that he was going to conquer death, and by this way of conquering death is you become invisible when the opponent is trying to hit you, but when you become untouchable, he ends up hitting himself, right in his face. So that's how Christ's revelation operates. He does not he lets all the aggressive he lets his aggressive enemies pent up all of their aggression upon themselves, right, and end up harming themselves, and he then makes an example out of death, He makes an example out of Satan. See, this is what happens when you engage in violence. You end up having all of these bruises and cuts, and you end up deforming yourself. Do you want to be like that? Or do you want to be like me, who, even though being nailed to the cross, was still resurrected in a perfect state, right? And then in this state, he is ruling from heaven. He is having complete control over history. And when we forsake that and go towards a path of violence, we are betraying our own lack of faith in Christ.
Yeah,
We
and
are
and the reason why this victim concern, in which people are trying to identify that they are the most aggrieved, so therefore they have the right to use overwhelming force to get revenge on their opponents. The reason why this fails is it fails ultimately for the same reason all scapegoat sacrifices fail after the cross, which is that they can't bind together. They don't create unity. They don't create people's togetherness. They don't resolve the bad blood that it's trying to resolve. It does not create unity. It does not create a discharge of bad blood. It just creates more and more schism. And when you have schisms, you can't work together to solve complex problems like science and technology or make profound, beautiful art as effectively, because you're too busy fighting and grieving against one another and resenting one another, not trusting one another. And when you're able to return to mythic institutions for order, you are not able to actually make things happen. For example, we have a FDA, sacrificially enclosed monopoly on the use of violence. They get to put people in cages that defy their concept of food and that defy their concept of medicine. And yet their approved medicine and food has poisoned the whole world and has given us the worst diseases known to man and mental health insanities. And yet the answers are right under our noses, and yet it's still not nearly as mimetically contagious as it should be to find the right answers about food. Same thing with government. Government has a monopoly on the right of education. It gets to steal your money, and it gets to use coercion with truancy laws to force people into their government factory school systems. And then, the private schools end up emulating so much of the public schools' ineffective modeling of education. And then, you have such a missed opportunity to cultivate free minds and critical thinking and joy in the next generation. They produce the same cookie cutter thinking and debased degeneracy and lack of creativity, lack of joy, lack of wonder, all that squeezed out by our system that's modeled after factories and prisons. So you have that. You have the food system. So I'm talking about the basic fundamentals. How do we rear our children? How do we raise our children? How do we put ourselves in a situation where we can have proper food and medicine? All those things are fundamentally broken because we've handed them over to sacrificially enclosed institutions that have the right of coercion. Who says they have the right? Well, because democracy. Oh, because some bull crap. Is Jack Posobiec and those guys, are they talking about abandoning the FDA? No, they're talking about putting their boys in to make sure they run it for what? The same pharmaceutical cartels that are always taken care of in the FDA? Nobody talks about abolishing that stuff. Nobody talks about getting rid of these things in any real way. And if they do talk about abolishing it, they don't talk about the positive things to replace it with, which is what a true leader does. A true leader doesn't say, we're just going to get rid of the FDA. A true leader says, we're going to get rid of these bad foods that the FDA and the USDA have promoted and subsidized, and we're going to get rid of those subsidies, and we're going to promote voluntarily and creatively and market. We're going to organize and collect and promote good quality food. And here are the foods that you should eat. And here are the things you should do for your health. Nobody's talking on that systemic level because they're all owned by the matrix of power. They're all owned by sacrifice. So they can't even see clearly where the sacrificial violence is happening. It's just assumed as if it's part of the landscape, like trees. You don't look at the trees and say, oh my God, those are the trees. If you're looking in a field, you just, It's just part of your subliminal, expectation of what you're doing. That's the same thing going on with these, fake conservatives, fake populists, all these fake people. They don't do anything to get anything done because they
And
can't see, like Christ sees, the futility of trying to create order and meaning and progress through sacrificial monopolies. It's just not going to work.
and I also think a true leader would not jump onto the warmongering bandwagon
Yeah,
and say, we will nuke Russia, we will nuke Moscow, we will nuke Beijing. A true leader would say, let's make peace, because it is from peace that we gain a lot of knowledge. And I'm not talking about the peace of, victor and the vanquished. I'm talking about a mutually acquired peace, right? Because when you have that kind of peace, then you have exchange of ideas, exchange of cultural ideas, and exchange of creative ideas. For example, this country over here, they have a lot of good engineering skills, and this country over here has a lot of good literature, artistic skills. So if you make peace with these countries, you will have those talents as well, because they will be encouraged to send. They will be also encouraged to see what makes your culture what it is, what makes your society what it is, and they will have that. They will be requesting that kind of knowledge from you. When you have that peace, they will be asking for that kind of knowledge, and you will be asking for that kind of knowledge. And this reciprocity, this back and forth exchange of ideas, of exchange of creative ways to stamp out scarcity, make new models of technology, and all of these things, these will benefit humanity as a whole. But people, especially the new right, tends to look upon these, what I have just said, they tend to look upon this as a kind of like a leftist cliche, right? Like one humanity, one race together, right? They look at this as a kind of cliche, but they don't realize that this is just been appropriated by the left. But the idea is not the leftist is in origin. The idea is it really starts with Christ. And it starts with his apostles when they talk about all of you are as one. When you enter the church of God,
yeah,
neither of you are Jew or Gentile or Greek or whatever.
yeah.
All
And
of you are.
they're right to point out that you can't. The left and these oligarch forces are importing millions and millions of young military-aged men into America, displaced, without a family, without their wives, without kids. You look at the buses; it's just filled with people, and they say you can't just import millions of young, restless 20-year-old guys and just say, okay, this is a natural flow of culture interacting with one
But
another.
that is how the idea is appropriated. But that's what
Right,
I'm saying.
right,
Is that idea is
right,
appropriated? You mix a little bit of
right,
sacrificial violence
right.
into something, and you let it spread.
Right, but that's
But
what I'm
that's
saying is that, like, they don't understand that the secret sauce that makes what we have in comparison to people who are rootless, coming from cultures where violence is much more part of life, is the nonviolent Christian aesthetic. And so to abandon that, right, to abandon that as a defensive mechanism against a sacrificial imposition from oligarchs through forced mass migration is not the answer, right? That's what I'm trying to get at, is to abandon the call, the standard of the cross, to say, well, we can't really imitate Christ the full way. That's a luxury that we can have only when we've cleaned up our situation with the barbarians at the gates. That's bullcrap. That's not how it works. You have to, and I'm not saying, by the way, that deporting people who were brought over here by oligarchs and having them deported is an act of sacrificial violence. I'm not saying it is. I don't think it is in certain situations, a lot of situations. But I'm also saying that to create hope that is the solution that one should be animated towards, right? As the primary mover that binds you together in a political movement, is not going to give you any results, because if you eliminate every single person who's been mass migrating over here illegally for years, because that's what the people who run America want, that doesn't solve the problems at the heart of America's cultural malaise. Doesn't even scratch really the surface in some sense. You still have the look in the mirror moment that needs to happen, right? And the look in the mirror moment that needs to happen involves understanding what I'm talking about, which is that you have to understand why we have this obsession with victims. And it is my opinion that the only way to alleviate that obsession with I'm a victim, no, no, I'm the aggrieved victim. And then the other person says, no, I'm the aggrieved victim. This competition over victimhood can only be solved when one returns to the reality that the only reason why we're fighting over this is because we're all Christ haunted and we all covet the perch of Christ on the cross, but none of us want to bear its weight in reality, and that we don't have to bear its weight, and that we don't have to live in that kind of delusion that we are able to bear the full power of being, God, in other words, and that we don't have to idolize our neighbor as God. And we don't have to live our whole lives in this tit for tat, zero sum mindset that we have to take them down a notch and make people that are different from us suffer, or people who have a different whatever. That's not the thing that's going to give you progress. Progress can only happen when people are transcending that and imitating Christ, and then finding out, for example, what elements are like and how they actually work. Because if we can create elemental transmutation at room temperature, that creates trillions and trillions and trillions of new wealth opportunities that can help rise up, because the free market people have a point in some sense. That's a Christian point, which is that honest contracts built on Christ derived commitments to the truth and fairness, honest contracts, respect for people's boundaries and properties. Those are the things that can then allow for amazing opportunities like taking trash, using microwave fields, and creating rare earth elements. So you don't need to have access to all these conflict zones around the world over mining rights and so forth and so on. We don't need to go to war with China over their access to tungsten or whatever it is that we're trying to get. These things can be literally developed in a laboratory at relatively low temperatures using applied magnetic fields to produce a more abundance of these rare earth elements, which then can then lift up the average person's wealth opportunities and deal a blow to things like pollution and things that people are concerned about.
And there's also like creative options for people who are not technologically inclined, right? Like, for example, like if somebody isn't, like we talk about lots of technological innovations here on this program, but I don't want, I think I don't want anyone to mistake, like if somebody doesn't have like a deep knowledge of physics or any deep knowledge of mathematics or any of these things, they can always, like a person with a family, a person with a family can raise the most wonderful family that can ever be found. And raising anyone who has a family knows that raising children is an art in and of itself, right? And a person who doesn't have a family can do something artistic or something that would benefit society as a whole from an artistic point of view, or whatever there is, right? A good business model or a good something. And a person who doesn't have such a high intelligence or acuteness can provide a good example of himself for the rest of the community through prayer, through encouraging others, through visiting the poor and the needy, whatever. It is a lot of talents that God can help us creatively utilize if we are really putting our skin to the game. Whatever it is, like we can't really stay in the back seat forever. Always have to be active because God is also active. And when God is working together with humanity, it's always progress in the truest sense of the word, right?
Yeah, everything has its own value, and people should not be sending their kids to government school if they can help it. Do whatever they can to not do that. They should not be getting into debt to horrible predatory lending and debt to own a house that will be completely dust in 100 years, probably. None of this stuff matters. Those things are not the things that you would put. Excuse me. Let me say this differently. Earth matters, and this life matters, and those things are matter. Those things matter, but they don't matter in a deformed sense in which you are going to live by lies like debt, like usury. That's a lie. And you live your life by usury, you're living your life by a lie. And if you live your life by saying, I'm taking my child to get an education, you're living by a lie because you are performing a lie. You're bearing false witness against your child. You're telling them that this is the way it should be. You're telling them this is the way they should be educated. You're telling them this is how they will learn about the world. That's a lie. And if you know that's a lie, then you know better. And you can't keep lying. You can't keep bearing false witness against your children by sending them into a situation saying, why am I going into this building? Because this is going to educate you. No, it's not going to educate me. It may give me some drips of education. That's fine because God's common grace works in all things. But it's not going to give me the education that I deserve, the education that is deserving of a dignified human being. Therefore, you're lying to me, parent. You're lying to me. You're lying to me. And you cannot live by lies. You say, I own this home. No, you don't. The bank owns it. You're living by lies. You don't need to live by lies. Live by the truth. Okay? You say you're eating food, but you're buying packaged goods that are literal in waste products, sludge that destroys your body, giving you diabetes at the age of 4, some kids, giving you horrible afflictions, mental illnesses. You can't even get along with people because you're mentally out of control. You're living by a lie. I'm doing what I'm supposed to do. No, you're not. You're feeding yourself toxic sludge that is not fit for an animal to consume, much less a human being made in the image of God. You're living by a lie, you see? We can't live by lies and expect the truth to result from our life. We have to live by the truth, right? The truth sets us free from diabetes and cancer and Alzheimer's and mental health issues. Not necessarily every person will be saved by from these things because some people are too far poisoned. And we have to have grace and mercy. But we, as a society, don't have to maintain these things as the standard of how we're going to live. And I think the reason why we need big anchor point inventions, like elements can be transmuted from other elements. The reason why we have to say those sentences is because those are such powerful truths that cut at the very core of what we have considered to be the end of history, according to the establishment. That once you scratch that off, you say, oh my God, history is only beginning. It's such an astounding thing that it sets itself like an orientation, like a magnet that will draw everything else towards it. So in other words, I think we have to do great things. Here's my theory. Society needs to have some great breakthroughs in the world of atoms in order to get people inspired to get off the couch and start living joyfully and wondrously in the world of atoms. And you see what I mean? Do you see what I'm trying to get at? Yes. In the meantime, don't be discouraged when I tell you elemental transmutation if you don't know what I'm talking about. I don't want you to, I understand what Surit's saying. Don't be discouraged to say, my God, I can't even possibly do this. Actually, you can. You don't need any mathematics or physics to do it. You need a microwave and some sand, but we'll get into that later. Number 2, you need a Target microwave. It costs $75, but I'm not telling you to do anything at home. Don't try this at home, children. Don't worry. But you need to get excited about these things. And if you have talents and you have money, you need to help invest in people who can do these things. If you're good at marketing, you need to help market the website that will talk about this. If you're good at this or that, you need to help, right? You need to all pitch in to help. If you're good at car repair, then you got to help fix the cars for the guys who are living off of artist salaries to make elemental transmutation a reality that can be replicated. You got to pitch in somehow. Help. That's what Christians do. We're mutual aid society.
You
So we
need
got
a
to
support
help.
network.
If you're good at encouraging words, write a really encouraging email to someone doing elemental transmutation. If you don't know anybody doing an elemental transmutation experiment, write it to me and I'll give it to the person who's doing it. Don't worry. We'll take care of everybody. And it's about coordination of people and ideas and talents together, right? And if you get an exciting project, like for example, we're going to the moon, right? That animated the whole that animated the whole societal flavor of that culture. Everybody was animated by this little animating experience. We're going to the moon. Okay. And that created a downstream effect culturally that was shaping people magnetically towards a direction in their lives that allowed for some really great things to happen. Now, I'm saying we need to have those same things today. We're going to create energy too cheap to meter that everybody can use without relying on the grid. Now you have an animating spirit. Now get it done. That draws people to get out of their couch, that gets them to stop eating the seed oils, that gets them to get good rest, that gets them to take care of themselves, that gets them to stop putting their kids in government schools, that gets people to stop thinking about all these, dumb waste of time things like fighting over people on social media and spend their time doing things in the real world.
Yeah, and in order to do those, we really have to remember that to keep in the theme with the show is that we really have to stop hurting others. We can't stop blaming others, especially stop blaming others and stop following these enslaving, the slavery systems. You need to get off the plantation, get off the slavery of debt, and slavery of social media and all of these other mind control technologies. Need to get off those things and refresh our mind, by, as you said, by enjoying the world of atoms. That really needs to be a precursor, because you can't really have and a creative mind when you're all the time you're in this cubicle multitasking, narrow-minded world in front of the computer or whatever. You can't have that kind of creativity when you're in that.
All right. I
Yeah,
appreciate your time. It's been great talking to you. Thank you.
thank you.
And if you want to email me, you can at hello@aneighborschoice.com or follow me at David Gornoski on X. And we will see you soon. Take care.